When Indiana got blown out by Ohio State on Saturday, it caused questions about whether the Hoosiers had played their way out of the college football playoff, but Ole Miss and Alabama said, not so fast. You can take our spot, Indiana, by suffering embarrassing defeats of their own, and now the SEC is left wondering if it can even get 4 spots in the college football playoff after 1 week ago, thinking that maybe it would be in position to grab 5 bids. Welcome into the SEC Football Unfiltered, our podcast from the USA Today Network. I'm Blake Toppmeyer alongside John Adams. John, I had I was at home last weekend. As you know, normally I'm at a game, but last weekend I was working from home, so I had the multiple TV setup in my living room, and on the game I was writing on, which was Ohio State, Indiana, that was on the big screen. And then on the TV off to the side, I had Florida Ole Miss. And, you know, as Indiana's getting blown out, I'm just thinking, well, you blew it, Hoosiers. You know, you had your chance. You didn't have to win this game, but you had to hold up well enough to show that, you know, you're not a total fraud. And then as I watched Ole Miss lose to Florida, I thought, maybe you didn't have to win after all, Indiana, because Ole Miss just took care of things for you. And then, of course, we saw what happened to Alabama against Oklahoma on Saturday night. So what do you make of this, John? Just Ole Miss and Alabama blowing their opportunities to be in the playoff.
Well, we've seen this before this season with other teams, but my goodness, Ole Miss is the best example of this. Everything's laid out for you. Kind of one of the all-time great Ole Miss seasons. At least it had that kind of potential. I think Ole Miss is better than any team it's played, but it's lost 3 games. So it was just an epic opportunity for that program, a program that's never been in the SEC championship game. It's the only old SEC West team that I guess never made it. So this is high cotton for the Rebels. And but they just couldn't cash in, spend all that money in NIL deals, picking up nice job of selecting players from the transfer portal. Already had a pretty good offense, and then strengthened the roster on defense with the transfer portal. It seemed like everything was coming together, yet really inexplicable losses. I know Florida's playing better, but that was just a huge loss for Ole Miss. It was a huge loss for Alabama, I think, more so for Kalen DeBoer himself than the program, because it looked like he was going to have Alabama right where it is supposed to be in the playoff. My goodness, look at how he's lost. He lost to Vanderbilt in Nashville, and now he turns around when everything's there for him. Doesn't have to beat a great Oklahoma team, and there have been plenty of great Oklahoma teams. Just has to beat a team that's struggling to stay above water, and he loses handily. Game was never close. It was pretty dominant. Looked like old-time Oklahoma football there for a while. So, yeah, just opportunities lost.
Yeah, and as we unpack this, John, I'm wondering who's got the bigger walk of shame in the aftermath of this? Is it Lane Kiffin or is it Kalen DeBoer? And as we kind of look at the case for each, let's look at Ole Miss first. As you mentioned, you know, powered by a strong NIL collective, and Kiffin, credit where it's due, he does have a knack for being able to evaluate talent out of the portal. He can get guys. He gets guys that work for what he needs. But despite all that, what we've seen here is you can buy players out of the portal. You can't necessarily buy killer instinct out of the portal. And I thought this team suffered from a gross lack of killer instinct. I mean, they had no business losing these 3 games that they lost to Kentucky, where they allowed Kentucky to have this miraculous 4th down conversion in the 4th quarter of that game. And then Ole Miss still had a chance to make a field goal to force overtime. They missed it. Then you go to LSU, a team that Ole Miss is better than. They controlled most of the game. Ole Miss did. Garrett Nussmeier, LSU's quarterback, got hot when that LSU defense that was the Ole Miss defense that was bought out of the portal needed a critical 4th down stop. They had no killer instinct. They couldn't deliver the stop, couldn't do it. They lost a game that they controlled most of the way. And then in this latest example, Ole Miss had 3 trips inside Florida's red zone that produced 0 points. Had a missed field goal in there, had some failed fourth down conversions in there. And yet again, I thought, like, this is the difference between a good team. Good teams win their clunkers. They don't always play great every week, but they find ways to win their clunkers. And their mental fortitude a lot of times gets them across the finish line in the fourth quarter of those clunker games. This team's the opposite of that. And then you look at Alabama, John, just an incredibly inconsistent season in year one under Kalen DeBoer. I mean, there have been times where Alabama's looked as good as any team in the SEC when they were destroying LSU and Baton Rouge, when they were blasting Missouri 34-0. I know it's not a great Missouri team, but they utterly destroyed them 34-0. When they went up to Wisconsin and wrecked Wisconsin, there have been different junctures of this season. And then how do we forget Georgia? I know Georgia rallied in that game, but there were times in that Georgia game where Alabama looked as good as anybody, but they're not consistent. They lose to Oklahoma. They lose to Vanderbilt. I mean, Oklahoma hadn't beaten an FBS opponent in nearly 2 months and beats Alabama. So both of them sitting here with 3 losses. Both of them would need a lot of help to somehow find themselves back in the playoff field. Who's got the bigger walk of shame, Lane Kiffin or Kalen DeBoer?
Well, it's close. I would pick Ole Miss because of its body of work. It had, as you spelled out, so many opportunities, just right there for the taking. How in the world that team could lose to Kentucky is baffling. And then in the Florida game, even I know the Swamp can be a menacing place to play for an opponent. I know Florida's playing much better. DJ Lagway is one of the most promising young quarterbacks in the country right now, I think. All that, still, that game was there for the taking for Ole Miss. One of the things that, to me, kind of epitomized its failings in that game were these short yardage plays. Again and again on fourth down, it brings in its baby bull of a running back, defensive tackle. How do you pronounce his last name? Is it Pegues or?
Yeah, I think it's Pegues. JJ Pegues.
Yeah. You know, it went outside the tackle 3 times. He did that and got stopped every time. I mean, I didn't understand that, but I thought it was kind of it was indicative of how Ole Miss played, and it did lose Trey Harris to an injury on a crucial play that looked like a completion, turned out to be an incompletion when he couldn't hold the ball after being tackled. He was hurt. Just all those kind of things. But you're so right, Blake. Take Georgia for the antithesis of this. Georgia, look at the last few years. Georgia's had games where it seemingly wasn't itself, where it was just kind of sleepwalking through the afternoon or evening. But it almost always managed to come through in the end. But you saw just the opposite with Ole Miss, and there it had 2 chances with Jackson Dart, the best quarterback in the SEC statistically by far. It's not close. Jackson Dart throws 1 interception. Looks like Ole Miss's chances are extinguished. Get the ball back. He's got another chance, throws another interception. It's just, gosh, so many opportunities. I guess that's why I think it was worse for Ole Miss, because Alabama's won so many championships. Ole Miss hasn't been in this position. And now it really has what looks like one of the most talented rosters in the country, and it just can't pull it off. What was significant to me about the Alabama game was Oklahoma struggled to run the ball all season because of its offensive line. It rushed for about 260 on Alabama. So there again, you think of all Alabama has to do is just keep Oklahoma close to its average offensive production. It couldn't even come close to that. 200-yard rushers, quarterback and running back. So it all the way, it was just it wasn't though. The thing about the Alabama-Oklahoma game, it wasn't even close.
Yeah, this is really splitting hairs here because it is a shameful walk, I think, for both Lane Kiffin and Kalen DeBoer in the aftermath of this weekend. But I think Kiffin takes the gold medal in the walk of shame here because this is still DeBoer's first season. Now, it's not a good first season. If Alabama doesn't make the playoffs, and they would need some help to get there, granted, this season, you can't rule anything out. Could be another messy Saturday. If it is, somehow Alabama could find their way back in. But even so, when you lose at Vanderbilt, you lose to a bad Oklahoma team, year one's a bust for Kalen DeBoer. But that doesn't mean the entire tenure is necessarily a bust for Kalen DeBoer. I look at Kiffin differently. Like, this is year 5 for Lane at Ole Miss, and it's been a great experience for all parties concerned. However, early in Lane's tenure, he was doing more with less. And he would usually beat the opponents, win the games that you thought, hey, he can win this one. He usually got it done in those games. He wasn't beating Nick Saban, but, he wasn't losing to Kentucky on his home field either. And then now, this year, he managed to do less with more. Like, that collective handed Lane Kiffin a roster that was probably talented enough to contend for the national championship. But he's not even going to make the playoff with that roster. And it being year 5, you just sort of wonder, I guess, is this all there is for Ole Miss and Lane Kiffin? And if this is all there is, it's still the best era of Ole Miss football since Johnny Vaught. However, I mean, with that collective and that roster, why couldn't it have been more? It should have been more. And then you add on top of that the fact that the guy that drove the dagger into Ole Miss's playoff hopes, Billy Napier, spent a season in the headlines paired with Lane Kiffin. Florida fans, for months, thought Kiffin could come in and be the savior. I don't know if Kiffin really ever wanted the Florida job. Didn't matter because it never opened. But to spend all season being viewed as the guy that Florida, at least the fans and some boosters, wanted if they were going to throw Billy Napier overboard, then to stand on the sideline with a stupefied look on your face as the final seconds ticked off and Billy Napier celebrates the victory. Yeah, I think that takes it there. That's the gold medal move and the walk of shame. And Kiffin stands atop the mountain here, the heap of also ran teams of what could have been. I think it's Ole Miss and Kiffin.
Imagine if Florida fans were told this morning that, hey, Lane Kiffin's really interested in that job. They would just shake their heads and walk away.
Well, think about it differently, John. What if you told Ole Miss fans Billy Napier's really interested in your job? You think Ole Miss fans would swap out Lane for Napier at this point? Maybe not. But yeah, how interesting of a twist this is.
I think Ole Miss fans can appreciate the big picture here because they have done so much better under Kiffin than they have under anybody since Johnny Vaught. We're talking back late 50s, the very early 60s, when Ole Miss was a national power. It hasn't been in that conversation for decades. And here Lane Kiffin got it right to the cusp. But I think now people look at Lane Kiffin differently. They still see him as this offensive guru, perhaps, but they look at him as a coach who can get you so far, but he can't quite get you across the finish line. If you want to hoist that championship trophy, you might ought to look somewhere else because he just hadn't been able to pull it off. And in other years, you could look at Lane Kiffin, as you said, you could say, well, he has Ole Miss where Ole Miss doesn't really belong. Right. I mean, it looks like an intruder and when it breaks into the top 10. It doesn't belong there. Not the program, not with that history. But he was changing that. And now I think it's as though he's hit his head really hard on that ceiling. And this might be as far as you go. I was trying to think of another coach, another program. Sometimes we depict a coach or a program and says, okay, maybe they can go 7-5, but that's it. Make a bowl. Maybe then you move it. Oh, well, maybe they're a 9-3 type program, but they're not a championship programs. And I was trying to think of a program where a coach has kind of changed that. But I look back, and when you think about other programs, other coaches, often when even if they hit a high mark early in their tenure, sometimes that's as high as it goes. They don't.
Yeah,
they
I mean,
don't
Kirby
go
Smart
any
kind of
higher.
changed it at Georgia, right? I mean, it's different. Georgia had more reasons, I think, to succeed historically when we're talking about recruiting base and that type of thing than what Ole Miss does. But, right, I mean, Kirby Smart comes in after Mark Richt kind of persistently butted his head up against that ceiling. It's like, why can't they go one step further? And then Kirby Smart changed that, a program that had won just one national championship that then wins back to back. But I do think it's different, much different situation than Ole Miss. But I think back to Lane's second season in Oxford. That was the Matt Corral year. It was just at the beginning of NIL transfer portal, so you really can't say that was the reason for his success. And Ole Miss that season blew away expectations, won 10 games, reached the Sugar Bowl. That year they lost to Alabama and Auburn, but they won at Tennessee in that dramatic mustard bottle game at Neyland Stadium. They beat LSU. They beat Texas A&M. They won the Egg Bowl. And to me, that was like the definition of Lane doing more with less. And as I said, it's like now he's been given more riches, more toys in the sandbox to play with, but the results haven't improved. And doesn't mean they never will, but I am left wondering, like, why is it that this team didn't have a killer instinct? Like, so many times we think, like, is the team taking its steps and its image and its mentality from the coach? Like, were they just not getting from Lane whatever that kind of intangible quality is that when things get tight, their blood pressure, their heart rate goes down? I mean, we've all seen those types of players, those types of coaches that, like when things get in crunch time, when the moment reaches its highest stakes, it's like they're a cool cucumber. No problem. We got this. Whereas this Ole Miss team, you just kind of felt like you were waiting for them to blow it. And they did that time and again.
Yeah. I wonder how much self-analysis Lane has done to see if there's some glitch, some screw that could be tightened, some something in the playbook that needs to be amended. I would think if I were in his shoes, I would do a lot of self-examining as to why you can only get so far. It's kind of like almost, I think of basketball coaches sometimes who do really well with less talent. I've seen it a lot in that sport. And they play a certain style of play, fare really well in that. Then they elevate the program, and so they can get a higher caliber player. And now they've got NBA prospects on their roster, but they don't go any further in the NCAA tournament. I've just seen that happen with teams. I don't know how good of an analogy that is, but I do wonder about Ole Miss. And something else I wonder, Blake, with Ole Miss, how does its collective view what's just happened? It's as though everybody was all in. You're willing to invest in this program. You've seen what Lane has done in building the program up. And so I think it was an easy sell for Lane to say, we're this far. We just got to push it up a little more. We just got to raise a little more money. For a few dollars more, we can get where we want to get. And so you pitch in, you give all you've got, and then you fall short. I wonder how boosters who are investing financially in this program view that process. Is that okay? Will they say, okay, I gave all I could, and this is what I got? I think I'll spend a little less, and if we're going to lose 3 games anyway, I'll spend a little less. Or will they say, okay, we're close now, I'm just going to keep spending?
Yeah, no, it is a good fork in the road moment, I think. Like if this is just what you are, if you're 9-3 team, then what's the point? But it's interesting because if there would have been a 12-team playoff last year with an inferior team, Ole Miss probably would have been in it, right? They won 11 games last year. They won the Peach Bowl, so it is just, yeah, it's a story of almost there, but not quite. Whereas I think the story for Alabama is different, John. Alabama had a more challenging schedule than what Ole Miss did, but there was enough talent there, I think, for Kalen DeBoer to make the playoff in year one. And whether there was or there wasn't, we know that is the standard at Alabama, and Kalen DeBoer knows that. He mentioned it to me before the season when I asked him if making the playoff in year one was a fair expectation. He said yes, that's the standard at Alabama. So by his own admission, he failed to meet the standard in year one. Now DeBoer's recruiting really well. I don't know that it's time to hit the panic button at Alabama, but what I'm wondering, John, is like, does this set up a playoff or bust scenario for Kalen DeBoer in year two? I don't have the buyout at my fingertips. It certainly would be expensive to move on from a coach that in this world of long, high-priced contracts. But I'm just trying to imagine in a 12-team playoff, Alabama going back-to-back years without making it. Now, that's not to say that's what happens next year, but I'm just wondering, missing it in year one, does that ratchet up the pressure so much that he's got to make it next year?
I think it does. However, when I look at that Alabama roster, it's a good team, but it's not comparable to the roster Alabama, not even close to the roster it had in 2020 when it won a national title. It was dominant throughout this season. It's also not as good as so many of those Alabama teams we saw under Saban. Some of them fell short, but they didn't fall as short and miss it by as much as Alabama and Kalen DeBoer did last Saturday in Norman, Oklahoma. I don't see the kind of talent on this roster that I'm used to seeing in Alabama. That's why if I were an Alabama fan, I would not be that down on Kalen DeBoer, because I don't think Nick Saban left Alabama with a roster just overflowing in talent. Mm-hmm. I think that's how a lot of Alabama fans will look at it, because they revere Nick Saban. They have him on a pedestal just as they had Bear Bryant. So those coaches can do no wrong. But when I look at what Nick Saban left Kalen DeBoer with, I didn't see a championship talent team. And I also just look at the offense. First of all, it wasn't an Alabama-like defense. It didn't just take over games. It had games where it looked really good. But there in Norman, Oklahoma, with Oklahoma's offensive talent, you would think a really good defense would absolutely smother the Sooners, because they just don't have that much firepower. But Alabama doesn't have that kind of defense. And you go to the offense, and it's really all about Jalen Milroe. Mm-hmm. He's their main guy throwing the ball, their only guy. He's their running game. I can remember seeing, I watched Derrick Henry and Najee Harris at Alabama, 2 college football's all-time great running backs. And a lot of guys that weren't at that level, but they were terrific college running backs who would have nice careers in the pros. We don't see that. We don't see it at all. And this Alabama offensive line was supposed to be so talented. The consensus was in preseason, it was a top 5 offensive line, not in the SEC, but nationally. We just don't see that. We just see Jalen Milroe has to be on. And we know from Jalen Milroe, he's not always on. He is a lot of times. He was against LSU, but he wasn't against Tennessee, and he wasn't against Oklahoma. And so I'm reluctant to blame Kalen DeBoer so much for a 3-loss season for Alabama.
Yeah, I mostly agree with you, John, that like the talent he was left was not like the typical level of talent Alabama had throughout the Saban era. My counterpoint would be there's still enough talent to beat Oklahoma. I mean, Oklahoma has been a disaster throughout the entire season. There still should have been enough talent to beat Vanderbilt. It's the teams that he lost to, and then if he would have lost to Georgia, well, that's one thing. I think you could say he wasn't left talent that stacks up with what Kirby has this year at Georgia, top to bottom, anyway. But yeah, it's who he lost to, losing to Vanderbilt, losing to a bad Oklahoma team that really hadn't had any semblance of any offense until Alabama showed up in town. And so now we're left with this scenario, John, where last week Greg Sankey was tweeting a little propaganda campaign about the SEC's strength of schedule, like, ooh, look at us. Look how many teams we need in the playoff. Well, it's interesting. Greg Sankey's Twitter account has gone silent, John. Crickets. Greg Sankey, as we record this, his most recent Twitter activity occurred on Friday night, in which he was sharing SEC soccer results. No word from the SEC boss after Saturday's results, because I think the reality that the commissioner, powerful though he may be, can't avoid is SEC is in a tough spot right now when you're looking at qualifying teams for the playoff. I mean, Georgia and Texas are in good shape. Georgia does need to avoid a loss to Georgia Tech this weekend, but assuming Georgia gets past Georgia Tech, Texas and Georgia are in good shape. Although, what if Texas loses to Texas A&M? Are we sure Texas is in at 2 losses? Maybe enough teams have lost around them that they could still get in, but it leaves them vulnerable. Tennessee's fine for now, but they need to beat Vanderbilt on Saturday. But even then, even if the favorites win, Georgia, Texas, and Tennessee, you're still left with just 3 playoff teams, unless you would get some substantial help elsewhere that would somehow allow Alabama or Ole Miss to get back into the picture. So I guess how unthinkable is this, John, that the SEC is left in a scenario where it may only qualify 3 teams? And does this convince you that we will have a bigger playoff come 2026? Because that's where I think I stand is, fair or unfair, the SEC is not going to stand for having just 3 playoff qualifiers. They will change the size or the format of the playoff to more tilt the deck into their favor starting in 2026 and beyond.
Well, one of the things that factored into this, we've seen super teams emerge from the SEC. That I mentioned that Alabama team in 2020. The LSU team in 2019, those back-to-back national title teams at Georgia, 2021 and 22. That was kind of a run of super teams. This year, we don't have that. I don't think any conference has teams as good as those teams, in fact. But I thought with the 12-team playoff, when I looked at these schedules in preseason, I could see a path to 10 wins for a handful of SEC teams. So I thought this expansion came along at just the right time for the SEC. And it was almost as though the conference schedules were constructed to the bottom half of the upper tier. It seemed to me got a little bit easier schedule. The top half, not so much. So to me, it was as though optimization of what the league was like, that would show up in the playoff field, that it would get 5 teams in. And it so easily could have. That's what's got to be bothering Greg Sankey right now, because it was all right there for him. In a way, everything had unfolded just as you would hope. And we could go back to the start of the season, though, when Texas A&M lost to Notre Dame game. I thought at the time that was a huge game for A&M and obviously for Notre Dame, which is playoff bound, it looks like. Even the LSU Southern Cal game, LSU lost that game. Southern Cal turns out to be a mediocre team. That didn't help the SEC. But my contention on the SEC's behalf is it's such a strong league in the middle and even down at the bottom. I'll kick Mississippi State to the curb this year. There's usually one team that just didn't get the memo. Hey, anybody can beat anybody on a given Saturday in this league. Mississippi State didn't really follow that line of thinking. So, but that's where, to me, it's a better conference than, say, the Big Ten. And I don't think the College Football Playoff Committee has put enough stock in strength of schedule this year. Nonetheless, those are the rules. And when we were talking before the podcast, you brought up, well, if you just don't lose more than 2 games. I mean, we go back to the history of college football. If you lost 2 games, you're done. There are a few exceptions. LSU won the 2007 national title despite losing 2 games, but it took almost a miraculous turn of events in the final week of the season. This year, it was, there was no miracle, but it's hard to, if you lose more than 2 games, you sound kind of whiny when you say, we should be in the playoff. It's okay if somebody on a podcast says it or a columnist says it, but if you start lobbying for, all you got to do is win one of those 3 games you lost. And look at Ole Miss. How can Ole Miss complain at all? All it has to do is beat Kentucky.
The other thing, John, is like, I don't think this is actually a good year for the SEC. Like, the idea that the conference is strong in the middle and the bottom, I think a lot of that's built on like historical reputation. I mean, you have Arkansas losing to Oklahoma State, one of the worst teams in the Big 12. You had Auburn losing at home to the Berkeley boys from Cal. You had Florida getting trounced by Miami. You had LSU losing to Southern Cal. You had Texas A&M losing to Notre Dame. Like, I don't know that the performance has been there in those non-conference matchups that you can really point to and say, like, yeah, the middle of the conference really is tougher than anybody else. I mean, you lose on your home field to Cal. I'm sorry, that's a bad loss, and I don't suddenly think Auburn is a good team now just because they beat Texas A&M. I think Auburn is a mediocre team that lost on its home field to Cal that also beat Texas A&M, and so I think that says more about the conference as a whole than it does about like the SEC's strength. I actually think it tells me that the SEC is down. You can't beat Cal, but you can beat Texas A&M. I don't know. I think that's kind of an indictment on the SEC, really.
I guess so. What I look at too is in comparison shopping. I look at the Big Ten. I still think the SEC is stronger overall than the Big Ten, and I wonder what Indiana would be. Strictly hypothetical. Indiana playing an SEC schedule. I don't think it would have been that exceptional of a team. It was in the Big Ten. It had just the right kind of schedule to prop it up. And when it finally faced a top 25 team, it looked completely out of its element and overwhelmed. But yeah, you could say that. You could say that against the SEC. And I do think you mentioned how this might affect Sankey wanting to expand the playoffs. You can't have only 3 SEC teams in the playoff, or we'll take our ball and go home. You can't have that. So here's something else that we won't see changed. If you have this much destruction within the conference, the SEC is not going to a 9-game league schedule.
The money would have to be really big, I think, at this point. It would take a really big pot sweetener, I feel like, to get to there. Or you would just have to change the rules to where the SEC gets a minimum of 4 bids no matter how bad they are. Everybody in the conference could stink, but it's preordained that they give 4 bids. That has been discussed at some level. We don't know the seriousness to which, but those conversations have occurred between the SEC and Big Ten, the power drivers of the future playoff format of, do we just rig the rules in advance to where we're pre-assigned so many bids before the season even starts? You could, if you did that, if you rigged the rules of the playoff, then you could play as many conference games as you want because those bids are going to be there for you in the end.
Well, here's another path to the playoff the SEC might consider, again, with its scheduling. Make it so you're not required to play another Power 4 team outside your conference in your non-conference scheduling. Load up on back teams. And instead of sitting with 8 teams and considering going to 9, why not just drop down to 7? Play 7 conference games. 5, work a Sun Belt Conference team in there. Maybe Conference USA is it still in existence? I'm never quite sure if Conference USA is still playing.
It does still exist.
Okay, good for it. And the American Conference and do it like that and just stack the deck. And I think the SEC will get plenty of teams in the playoff that way. But it will be curious to see Sankey's reaction, public reaction, if the SEC only gets 3 teams. Now,
his reaction right now is silence. It's like he's forgotten the password to his Twitter account.
I think he's probably making some phone calls. I think, and the message is, we can't have this.
You think those are the phone calls or to his ADs, presidents, coaches? I mean, because they're responsible for this too. They're the ones that put the product on the field. Now, no, it's probably to the people pulling the strings of the college football playoff, I guess, is what you're thinking.
Yeah, I think yes. I don't think he will. I don't think he will look inside the conference. I think everything will be positive about the conference, even though there have been, as you pointed out, some very negative games. And look, it's just, you can look at it 2 ways. You can say, and here's the way Greg Sankey will look at it. These other schools and other conferences don't realize how hard it is to beat Kentucky, even when it's 4-7.
Is it hard to beat 4-7 Kentucky?
Well, it was hard for Ole Miss.
Yeah,
it was hard for Ole Miss. In Georgia, as you remember, barely escaped Lexington with a 1-point win.
It wasn't very hard for Texas. Maybe the moral of the story is, you want to strengthen your conference, you need to start inviting some real programs in here from the Big 12, because Texas had no trouble handling Kentucky on Saturday, and it hasn't had much trouble finding its way to the top of the standings of this league that was supposed to be so tough.
I think, and I lobbied really hard for Oklahoma State to get in this conference, and look what's going on with Oklahoma State.
John, we got this glob of 3 lost teams now in the SEC. When we just look at overall record, not necessarily conference record, the one with actually control of their path to the playoffs still is Texas A&M. It's as if that loss to Auburn really didn't affect the Aggies that much at all, because if they go out and upset Texas on Saturday in College Station, wouldn't have to be that big of an upset. The line is within 1 score. Texas A&M would be playing Georgia in the SEC championship. You win there, you're in the playoff. So of these upset defeats, Ole Miss, Alabama, Texas A&M going down last weekend, Texas A&M was the least damaging because they still have control over their path to the playoff. If one of them were to get some help to get in the playoff, I think Alabama is probably at the top of the heap. I mean, as ugly as that loss to Oklahoma is, I mean, if you get a few more upsets on Saturday, if Miami goes down to Syracuse, if South Carolina beats Clemson and hands Clemson a 3rd loss, like, it might get to the point where the committee really has no choice but to accept a 3-loss team for the final spot. I would think Alabama would probably sit at the top of the the heap of 3-loss teams because of its strength of schedule. But I'm wondering, just as you see it, there are 5 3-loss teams in the SEC right now. We're talking overall record, not conference record. It's Alabama, Ole Miss, Texas A&M, South Carolina, who, if they beat Clemson, maybe they have a case for a long shot playoff bid. And then Missouri is the 5th SEC team sitting on an 8-3 record. As you look at those 5 teams that are 8-3, how would you rank them from worst to best? And do you think that's how the committee will view them if they need to take one of those teams for a playoff spot?
Possibly. It might start at the bottom and says, okay, let's make a case for eliminating Missouri, for example. I think Missouri stands out. It had a weak schedule by SEC standards, and I think that schedule propped up its record a little bit. Yeah, I don't look at Missouri as a playoff contender. I just look at it as a bowl eligible kind of team. Even though it could finish 9-3 and win a bowl and be 10-3, but it never really resembled a 10-3 team. What's its big win? By 3 over Vanderbilt? Is that? I'm trying to think. What
yeah, the Vanderbilt win might be the best win on Missouri. Well, they beat Oklahoma, which now suddenly we were supposed to respect Oklahoma, I guess. So I guess it's either Vanderbilt or Oklahoma. Those are the big wins for Missouri.
I guess I would have Missouri 5th.
Mm-hmm.
So let's cast it aside right now. Move on to Texas A&M. The irony is that Texas A&M still could win the SEC championship.
Yeah, so you're saying the Aggies, and I happen to agree with you, the Aggies are the 4th best of this glob of 8-3 teams. We saw them get blown out by South Carolina. The win against LSU was nice at the time, doesn't look quite so good now. But because one of those 3 losses was a non-conference loss to Notre Dame, they are the team that still has a chance to get to the conference championship. So it is fascinating, as you say, like they can win the SEC championship and get in. But I think you're right in saying in this group of 8-3 teams, they're probably the 4th best among them, but they're the ones with the control of their destiny.
Yeah, when Ward Manuel, the chairman of the selection committee, addresses us the final time and explains the process as best as he can, it's a challenging endeavor, but he will say the eye test will come up. Well, we've got a lot of knowledgeable football people, and they look at these games and they can look at a team and see, yeah, it's a playoff caliber team. I go back to that opening game for A&M against Notre Dame. And if you watched A&M's offense and you thought it was a playoff caliber team, then you shouldn't be on the selection committee. A&M has had a lot of chances. And think of it's inconsistent. It's gone back and forth between quarterbacks. It started out with Connor Wigman, went with him too long against Notre Dame. I thought for sure it'd pull him at halftime. It didn't. Now it's going with more of a running quarterback. That's helped a little, but it didn't help enough against Auburn. A&M has had some good games, but it's had some really bad games, and it just got vanquished by South Carolina recently, and then lost to Auburn, which Auburn is gifted at finding ways to lose close games. That's its signature, accomplishment. It can lose. It will find it's very resourceful when it comes to losing games of that nature. So, yeah, I would eliminate Texas A&M right there.
Yeah, as long as they don't win the SEC. So moving on, who's your number 3 team in this group of 8-3 SEC squads?
See, that gets harder. South Carolina, I guess, because
they lost head-to-heads with Alabama and Ole Miss.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then it's had some really good games though. But then I would go with Alabama next. As inconsistent as it's been, it's got a big win over Georgia. That should count for a lot. And then here I am with Ole Miss.
Fascinating, isn't it?
A team I've been ripping for its performance with everything on the line. A team that is underachieved severely. But see, when I look at it and I give it that old eye test, I think, well, if it was playing one of these teams, I'd probably pick Ole Miss.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like South Carolina has the best chance of this group, other than A&M. And I keep putting A&M in a different category because A&M's path is clear. They beat Texas. They win the SEC championship. They're in. If they don't do those two things, they're not in. So I kind of set them aside. Of the other three teams that we're talking about here, like, does a long shot path to the playoff exist? Ole Miss, Alabama, and South Carolina. South Carolina's got the chance for the marquee victory, right? They play 9-2 Clemson in a rivalry game this week, a top 20 matchup. Like, they have the best chance this weekend to impress the committee. And if I was Shane Beamer, I'd be calling up every lobbyist I knew, trying to get in the committee's ear, saying, hey, if we beat Clemson, don't forget about us. But what's hurting South Carolina is they lost to the other two teams in this conversation. They lost to Alabama. They lost to Ole Miss. And so that's why I think even if South Carolina beats Clemson, I think they're going to be on the outside looking into the playoff. It might eliminate Clemson from the conversation, but I don't think it catapults South Carolina past Alabama and Ole Miss because they lost to those two teams. So my question would be, John, if some chaos ensues, right? Let's say Syracuse beats Miami and South Carolina beats Clemson. And after all this, the ACC winds up with one bid after all. SMU wins the ACC, and Miami and Clemson limp their way to the finish. And that unlocks a spot for a 3-loss SEC team. Who do you think's more appealing to the committee, Ole Miss or Alabama? They both beat Georgia. They both had some bad losses. Alabama's strength of schedule is a little bit better than Ole Miss. You think on the eye test, and I probably agree with you, that Ole Miss is a little bit better of a team than Alabama. But if it's down to those two and the committee has to take a 3-loss team because they're just out of other options, really, which one do you think they'd go with?
I think they'll take Alabama.
I think so, too.
I think Alabama's almost a compromise. I mean, Alabama beat South Carolina. Ole Miss beat South Carolina. Alabama and Ole Miss beat Georgia. But Alabama's been a little more consistent. Alabama overwhelmed LSU in the second half of the season. Ole Miss lost to LSU. Mm-hmm. So I think it's just, and I don't think it would bother the committee putting Alabama, traditional power, in the playoff as opposed to putting a relative newcomer to power football in Ole Miss in the playoffs. So, yeah, I think it will pick Alabama. But here's the other thing. What if Alabama loses Saturday?
Oh, my stars. Now we're getting really chaotic. Alabama loses the Iron Bowl. South Carolina beats Clemson. Syracuse beats Miami. And if you're listening to this thinking, like, you guys are you're talking stupid nonsense stuff, right? Like, well, we just went through a weekend where Florida beat Ole Miss, Oklahoma beat Alabama, and Auburn beat Texas A&M. So I don't think it is, out of the realm of possibility. It's a little far-fetched, but it's not crazy to think that Clemson, Miami, Alabama could all go down on Saturday. I mean, we said before the season, John, that there would be a year that a 3-loss team would make the 12-team playoff. Little did we know, maybe, that it could be year one where a 3-loss team makes the playoff. And a 3-loss team that lost to Vanderbilt, no less.
Yeah, we might already be there. Yeah. And you're right, though. You look at what happened last weekend. And we're talking about those 3 SEC losses. The favorites in those games had everything on the line, everything to play for. Wins by Oklahoma, what did that do? Yeah, it made Oklahoma feel better about its football program, but it's not elevating it to higher ground. You had A&M, it turns out, Auburn, what does that do for Auburn? It's still it's going to play in a lower level bowl game. that's what's fascinating about this. The teams with everything to gain, it's almost as though they couldn't handle the pressure, and the underdog was playing fast and loose and prevailed.
John, we're recording this on a Monday afternoon. When folks are listening to this, they may have seen the college football playoffs, depending on when you're listening to this. I'm wondering where you think Alabama will be in the playoff rankings on Tuesday night. In the coaches poll, USLBM coaches poll, Alabama was 13. I think Alabama will be 14 in the playoff rankings on Tuesday. That puts them kind of on the verge of, hey, if we need somebody, if chaos ensues this weekend, we got you there, but we're not sending the message that you're in for now. You're not in for now, but we're keeping you in the on-deck circle if you're needed. Where do you think the Alabama will be in Tuesday night's playoff rankings?
14 sounds about right.
Yeah.
It's that the polls, the top 25 polls in the CFP rankings haven't varied greatly. And I do think Alabama, over those, you looked in the polls, Alabama ranks above the other three lost teams we're talking about in the SEC. So it's reasonable to think that it has the best shot. And maybe, I don't want to tell Kalen DeBoer how to run his football team, but maybe his approach should be, after the Oklahoma loss so decisively, he should say, hey guys, we got no shot at the playoff. Let's just go out there and have fun and beat Auburn and win a state championship. Let's don't worry about the playoff.
Yeah, a little fast and loose. I think Ole Miss and Alabama both could have used a little of that mentality on Saturday. All right, John, let's pick some games, see if we can get back to 500 after terrible weeks for both of us. We were right in the category of Alabama and Ole Miss's performance with our picks. I went 2-4. I am now 36-38 for the season. You went 1-5. Kent State losing was your claim to fame last weekend. You're now 35-39. So our records are trash, but it is close in this heated contest we have. I got a 1-game lead over you. So we got rivalry weekend. We won't pick them all, but we'll pick several. Let's start off, John, with the Iron Bowl. Sometimes we save the big games toward the end, but well, this isn't as big of a game as it once seemed like it could be. Alabama is an 11.5-point favorite at home against Auburn, riding high. What are you thinking here?
I don't have to think about that a long time. I'll take 11.5 points with Auburn.
Auburn, as you say, has mastered the art of losing in close fashion. They flipped that script against Texas A&M, although there was a moment there where I thought Auburn was going to blow the lead. I mean, that would have just been an Auburn special, right? But
yeah, it was up 20. It was up 21-0 in that game. Let's remember that.
Right. The fact that it even had to go to 5 overtime sort of speaks to Auburn's inability to put opponents away. But they don't get blown out often. So 11.5 points. We're both taking the points there. How about another in-state rivalry game with playoff implications? Wouldn't Vanderbilt and Diego Pavia love to do some serious damage to Tennessee and their playoff hopes? Tennessee went from like first team out of the playoff last week to now, if they catch just even like 1 or 2 breaks ahead of them, say Notre Dame loses to Southern Cal or Penn State loses this weekend, Tennessee could not only be in the playoff, they could be hosting a first-round playoff game. That goes to show how much your fortunes can change week over week, but it can go the other direction too. And Tennessee, a 11.5-point favorite at Vanderbilt. Same line as the last game, John. Vanderbilt, they're tough to blow out. I do feel like they've lost a little bit of steam. We've talked about that in recent weeks, but they covered the spread last week in a loss to LSU. They haven't been blown out too terribly often this season. Really, I can just think of the one time they lost in lopsided fashion to South Carolina. Otherwise, they've been in every game. I'm going to take the 11.5 points and take Vanderbilt. I think Tennessee wins, but I like Vanderbilt with the 11.5 points.
Yeah, I kind of see that as a 10-point game, and I saw one line that did have it 10 points. But Tennessee just doesn't blow out people. And
Unless it's UTEP.
unless it's, well, yeah, outside the conference. It's played two of the worst teams in the country, and my beloved Kent State and UTEP. But the question I have about Vanderbilt is Diego Pavia, it's quarterback. He's been bunged up. He plays through injuries. I don't know how many more hits he can take. Tennessee's been rough on opposing quarterbacks. I think the odds are against his finishing the game in this one. However, what surprised me more about Vanderbilt is not Pavia's play at quarterback, but Vanderbilt's defense. It hangs in there. It just, even against Texas, how did it hold a team with Texas, all of its offensive talent and speed, held it to 27 points? If it can do that to Texas, it can hold Tennessee down. So, yeah, I'll take the points too.
All right, we're in lockstep so far. That's probably a bad sign for those underdogs in those games. How about Oklahoma and LSU? John, LSU, Brian Kelly, we said been facing some heat in recent weeks. Well, Lane Kiffin and Kalen DeBoer did him a solid last weekend, took a little bit of attention away from Brian Kelly, and LSU had a little bit of a get-right game, held off plucky Vanderbilt and getting to 7-4. Now they try to get to 8-4. They're at home against Oklahoma. Will Oklahoma know how to handle success? LSU is a 6-point favorite in Baton Rouge.
I'm not convinced that Oklahoma's suddenly discovered offense based on what it did against Alabama, but I do think its offensive line is playing much better. And I think Oklahoma has a really good defense. Mm-hmm. Few NFL guys on that defense. And Danny Stutzman, linebackers, one of the best players in the league. So I think LSU will win the game, but I like OU to benefit from that point. So I will take OU in the points.
Okay. I'm tempted by this one as well, but boy, I don't know. The idea of Oklahoma keeping it together 2 weeks in a row. Of course, the idea of LSU keeping it together 2 weeks in a row right now isn't very appealing either. That's kind of where I go back to. I'm not quite as high on the middle of this conference as maybe some others. I don't really feel much confidence in either of these teams, but we'll go the other direction. I'll take LSU and try to extend a little bit of a lead on you here, or give it all away. Another one, John. This one is, well, it is interesting to the college football playoff mix. Clemson I feel like has worked its way back into the conversation, what once seemed preposterous a few weeks ago. Clemson team that lost on its home field to Louisville, and whose best win, I guess, is against Pitt. Well, Clemson, if they beat South Carolina, they'll be at 10-2, and I think just waiting for someone ahead of them to stumble and try to steal a spot. South Carolina going on the road to Clemson. I think Clemson, boy, I guess maybe this is a little anti-SEC bias. A little, I've been ragging on the SEC in this pod, John, but I guess I'll stick with it. I'm going to take Clemson to win at home and to cover the 2.5-point spread.
Well, I've defended the name of our podcast and the conference throughout this episode, so I'll stick with it. I'll take those. How many points did you say? Is it 2.5?
2.5. Yeah.
2.5. Yeah. I'll take South Carolina. It's won 5 in a row. I love its defensive front. So I'll take the. It's be a lot easier to pick South Carolina if it were at home, but I'll go with South Carolina.
That was exactly my feeling, John. It really didn't come down to, for the sake of entertainment, I say it comes down to a little anti-SEC bias, but it really came down to this game being at Clemson. If this game was at South Carolina, I certainly would have picked the other direction. Big game that we haven't talked much about, John. The rivalry renews for the first time since 2011. Texas at Texas A&M, a game with massive playoff implications. Wouldn't even matter if there were playoff implications in this one. It'd be a huge game returning to Thanksgiving weekend. One of the great Thanksgiving traditions, I think, in this sport is back. Texas wins. Well, there's no question about it. They're in the playoff, and it's just a matter of what their seed is going to be. Texas A&M, as we've laid out for them, they have to beat Texas, and they probably need to win then the SEC championship, win 2 in a row to claim the auto bid and get to the playoff. Texas is a 5.5-point road favorite. I really like Texas, John. You know I have all season. They were disastrous at home in that first half of their only loss against Georgia. They've faced criticism for weeks about their kind of middle of the road strength of schedule. This strength of schedule conversation, it's all great fodder, but I like teams that go out and win games. And Texas repeatedly goes out, wins games, looks good on both sides of the ball to me. They're not a perfect team, but if you give me, say, 4 or 5 teams that I can pick to win the national championship, Texas absolutely would be on my 4 or 5 team short list that can win the national championship. So I'm going to pick Texas to get it done in what's probably going to be a very, very raucous environment at College Station. I'll give the 5.5 points and take the Longhorns.
When I look at Texas, I see a very talented team. What bothers me about Texas is how many times I've seen it not reach that talent level on the scoreboard. I don't know. This is a team that puzzles me a little bit. To me, it's the most complete team in the league. The 2 most complete teams are, to me, Texas and Ole Miss. Ole Miss is lost games it should have won. Texas hasn't.
Mm-hmm.
So credit Texas for that. But man, I lived in Texas for a few years. I know how much this rivalry means. And giving A&M that many points on its home field, I got to take the Aggies there. I think hatred is a great motivator in college football. There's a lot of hate attached to this rivalry, and I think it will. I would pick Texas to win the game, but maybe about just a field goal.
Yeah, and this game obviously means a ton to both programs, but I think you could make the argument that it means more to Texas A&M than it does to Texas. If Texas loses, it maybe could still get in the playoff at 10-2. A&M has to win to have a chance at the playoff. Plus, A&M, Texas always views it as little brother. If Texas comes in and beats it in year 1 in the SEC, you better believe that's going to be a whole offseason of A&M having to listen to how their little brother, and they had a 12-year head start of being in this league, and Texas still comes in and beats them in year 1. Yeah, it's going to be a huge game, but I think it means the world to Texas A&M. So, yeah, I'm really interested in covering this one on Saturday. Environment's always great in Kyle Field, but you put Texas in that building, it's going to be electric. All right, John, who's Kent State playing this week? I assume you're going back to the well of picking against Kent State for your lock of the week. It worked for you last week?
I watched every play of that Kent State game last week against Akron. On paper, it looked like 2 of the worst teams in the country playing. And on the field, it looked like 2 of the worst teams in the country playing. Yeah, so impressed with Kent State. Its ability to just always, when you think it can't get any lower, it drops down a notch or 2. And that's what's impressed me so much about this team all year. So it's playing, I looked at that MAC schedule. I just glanced at it. It didn't really matter who Kent State was playing. Is it Bowling Green this week, I think?
It's Buffalo, John. Buffalo is a 21.5 point favorite, Buffalo is. Are you see, I assume you're picking against Kent State, right? You're giving the point.
Of course, yeah.
Buffalo.
Yeah, I think I'm like for Kent State being bad.
Yeah, you're for Kent State losing.
Yes, I'm for it losing, but I'll watch all that game. I think it's isn't it I think it's another Tuesday night.
It's a Tuesday night special.
Yeah,
a little State. Thanksgiving appetizer. Well, that brings us to the Thanksgiving main course, John, because I'm going group of 5 for my lock of the week as well. This game is on Thanksgiving night, I believe. Normally we have the Egg Bowl on Thanksgiving night. The Egg Bowl is being played on Friday this year, and that gives the college spotlight going up against the NFL to Memphis and Tulane. Tulane is sitting there ready for a playoff spot. If Boise State loses, again, Tulane would be the beneficiary if they win the AAC, the American. I think they're the first team up after Boise to get that group of 5 bid to the playoff. Tulane's been playing really well. I don't know if you've seen much of them, John, but they've been not only beating teams in the American, they've been crushing teams in the American. They are a 13.5-point home favorite against Memphis. I'm going to give the points, take Tulane to win in convincing fashion and stay in the playoff mix. It'll be all playoff all the time here as we navigate this final sprint towards Selection Sunday. John and I will stay with you throughout it. Thanks for listening to this edition of SEC Football Unfiltered.